We are, yeah, what I wanted to talk about, and I hope this is meaningful for people, is really the concept of more with less. Uh, it's there was a discussion about, should we change our theme from that, and what does more with less mean? I like more with less quite a bit. It's sets a clear direction, but it also leaves a lot of possibilities open, including possibilities people didn't think of. So let's talk about this. I mean, there are well-known people who would impose methodology on others, and I have friends who say they're disrespectful to criticize ideas from famous methodologists. But I think we should be hostile to methodology, and especially skeptical when it's coming from famous people, because I think it can distort our perceptions a bit. And I know respect is important, but let's also show respect for the people doing the work, the practitioners, the people with their hands dirty in the work. And programmers aren't dumb. The people I'm interested in are not looking for miracle cures, and I think we should end the conspiracy of silence. Is all that noise coming in the audio?
It's from your side, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. You can tell that's probably the safe delivery truck outside. So one way to tell a beginning bicyclist is that they want to add things. So I want to put on a cushier seat and the kickstand and all these attachments and the bell and whistle and all these things. But someone who's been cycling for a while looks at it differently. They're looking for things to remove. How do we save? And actually down to the last ounces. One of the hallmarks of a beginner versus someone who's had more experience doing this. Or we can think of a picture frame. Now, you don't notice the frame if the picture frame is doing its job properly. You notice the beauty of the picture. And this is how I suggest we should look at a framework also. The emphasis is not on the framework. The emphasis is on the thing that it frames, the work that it frames. I wonder if that analogy makes sense. Now, the less rules, they just fit on 1 or 2 pages. There's some interesting backstory to why there's so little here. It's a barely sufficient framework to kickstart empirical process control and the whole product focus. So barely sufficient. Why would we want that? Why wouldn't we start with everything and then try to tailor it down? In theory, we should get to the same place, right? If we start with everything in the kitchen sink and then start cutting out the stuff we don't need. But the thing is, we're making those decisions typically at the beginning when we know the least. And the burden of proof should be on the addition of more methodology rather than the person who would subtract things. I suggest more with less. We'll actually review the less rules, just because I was at a conference with a bunch of experts and most of the people at my table turned out not to know what the less rules were. And these are people who had been trained in less and certified and all kinds of stuff. So I do want to take just a minute to review what the less rules are. So the less framework applies to products with 2 through about 8 teams. More than that, we have less huge. But don't do, the only less huge rule I'm actually going to cover now is that less huge applies to products with more than 8 teams. So don't do the stuff in less huge unless you really do have more than 8 teams working on the product. The idea is we need to justify the additional complexity that comes with that. So if we're talking in a product organization with less than 8 teams, we shouldn't even be talking about area product owners or any of that. It's very easy to mix that up. Teams. Structure the organization using real teams as the basic organizational building block. It seems like a simple thing. Real teams is not as simple as it would sound. We use real teams in the sense that Dr. Richard Hackman would describe a real team. So every company thinks that they're using teams, and I've heard the word team used to refer to like 100 people or a tiger team that we threw together at the last minute. People who have all these other responsibilities are suddenly given additional responsibilities on top of that, and we're calling that a team. So we really mean real teams when we say real teams, and there's more details about what a real team is. So each team is self-managing, cross-functional, co-located, and that's an interesting problem now, and long-lived. And long-lived, we're talking about months or years, right? Not what at one place I worked, they called a tiger team, people they threw together at the last minute to solve other problems on top of their regular responsibilities. So we really mean these things, and the implications are far-reaching. The majority of the teams are customer-focused feature teams. A feature team means, for instance, we're not doing work that gets handed off to another team, and our team is not developing inventory that's handed off to another department or has to be integrated with something else. For the most part, the work we're doing should be able to see the customer in the work we're doing. And that should show up in our source code also. If I'm looking at the product code, it ought to be written in the domain language. So I wouldn't have to be necessarily a programmer if I had to understand some of the code that we're writing, if I'm a domain expertise, if I have some knowledge about what the problem space is, and we're doing the other practices that we'll get to, it should be understandable. It shouldn't be so cryptic. I kind of understand why people are afraid of programming nowadays. When I look at the legacy code that most companies produce, it's like, yeah, this would scare me out of working in that field also. But I think if you look at good code, you're not so turned off by the profession of creating software, writing software. All right. Scrum Masters are responsible for well-working LeSS adoption. Their focus is towards teams, product owner, organization, and development practices. So this goes beyond what someone thought a Scrum Master was before, someone who drives the team in a particular way. Scrum Master does not focus on just one team, but on the overall organizational system. There's a beautiful picture you can see on the LeSS site that shows the focus, how the focus of the Scrum Master changes over time. Initially, the Scrum Master would focus on the team and the product owner, because initially they don't necessarily know what this looks like, and there's a lot of old habits to get rid of. But past a certain point, you can't make very much of a difference just in the team room. Past a certain point, the problems the teams are running into go beyond what's in the team room. They show up in the team room, but their sources are elsewhere. For instance, the policies, the HR policies, the structure, stuff that we'll call organizational design. Just to take a practical example. So a place I was working with, they finally got cross-functional teams together. Great. Now we have people on the same team reporting to 3 different managers. So I'm supposed to be focused on the goal, what our sprint goals along with the rest of the team. At the same time, I have another agenda. I've got a performance appraisal coming up. And according to the performance appraisal, to get to the next job title, I should spend less time testing or less time helping someone else on my team. So this has absolutely a contradiction there. And unless the guidance is a much simpler, here's the picture. So instead of slides, I'll just show parts of the book. A much simpler organizational structure. For example, a small company might just look like this. So we think we get more organization when we have less organizational complexity. So more with less. A Scrum Master is a dedicated full-time role. I guess everyone has stories about trying to be a part-time Scrum Master and what usually happens. Okay, I'm 70% programmer, 30% Scrum Master. But then the work always expands to fill that, especially if the thing that I would do as a Scrum Master is unclear or uncomfortable, or it's the actively doing nothing that Victor was talking about. That's hard to do. And so it's very easy for me to escape to what I'm comfortable with, my strong suit, which might be writing code or doing some other thing. So we don't want to provide that out. We want the Scrum Master to be really focused on this as a dedicated full-time role. And we also say one Scrum Master can serve 1 through 3 teams. So a place I was working with said, okay, if we can have a 30% Scrum Master on each team, and they said, well, what about 1 real Scrum Master for 3 teams? I'd probably rather have the second if I had to choose between those things. It's still open for debate whether every Scrum Master every team needs a full-time Scrum Master. About 12 years ago or something, I wrote about reasons why a team might need a full-time Scrum Master, and the list of things that I would want to be solved before a Scrum Master told me they were done with their job. And to this date, no one has sent that to me with all smiley faces saying, okay, I'm done doing the Scrum Master. It hasn't happened yet. Of course, maybe my spam filter would have blocked that. So managers are optional in LeSS. But if they exist, their role is likely to change. Now, nearly every place has managers. So the role changes to something a lot more interesting. Instead of managing the day-to-day work, our role shifts to improving the value delivery capability of the product development system. My wife came up with this, that they're also developers. Managers are developers, but they're developers of the organization. They're building the capability of the organization. Now, this is also, when we say managers are optional, I do know of now, of course, there's lots of small companies where there's no management role. I know of a place about 150 people where there's also no manager role. There's one CEO is the product owner, and then beyond that, it's self-managing teams. So we know it's humanly possible to do this, and probably it's possible with organizations larger than that. Now, I have a friend who's working at a company with just 120 people, and she told me there's 10 directors here. And by the way, they're all men. Interesting problem. So manager's role in LeSS is to improve the product development system by practicing Go-See, encouraging stop and fix, and experiments over conformance. For the product group, establish the complete LeSS structure at the start. This is vital for LeSS adoption. For a large organization, beyond the product group, adopt LeSS evolutionary using Go-See to create an organization where experimentation and improvement is the norm. So that's the first half of the LeSS rules we've covered right there. There's not much there. So we think with less rules, you get more done and more effectively. The LeSS rules, even smaller than the Scrum Guide. Scrum Guide is like 18 pages or something. This is just 1 page. I mean, unless you count LeSS huge and call it a page and a half or something. Not much there. Picture frame, right? Picture frame. Focus is not on the framework. The focus is on the work, the people doing the work, and the customer that we want to connect with. Large-scale Scrum is not Scrum under layers of conventional management. It's Scrum. It's the idea of Scrum expanded to multiple teams. Less organizational complexity means more organization. Also say less JIRA means more collaboration. One of my pet peeves is this. It seems to be driving the process. And I worked at a company that used to develop a tool, and we had the best intentions, a tool which would really help you do Scrum. And it was focused on just Scrum and nothing else. We were deluged with requests to water it down. So how do we handle a person that's on 3 teams? How do we handle X, Y, Z thing? Eventually, owner of the business gave in to some of that, and I think this is inevitable for tools. Even starting off with the best intention, inevitably it seems like they're going to become corrupted by the demands for this. We could buy 1 million licenses if we just add this little waterfall feature, this little traditional management feature. So that's kind of sad, and I don't know how to handle that with COVID now. We're working separately. But I certainly think simplifying this quite a bit and letting the organization and team own their tools. especially the sprint backlog as something that's owned directly by the team. That's not anyone else's business to see that except the team, the people doing the work. Fewer role distinctions means more coverage of responsibilities, or the way Bus would put it. The more you give responsibilities to named roles, the more you take them away from the team. The more responsibilities you take away from the team by giving them to named roles. So we want fewer named roles, and we want less emphasis on it. So in my video you saw, we wouldn't want to have a team output owner per team. If we have 20 people working on the product or 2,000 people, we want to be team members and not have the process impose what our working relationship will be with other people. Now, this doesn't mean everyone's interchangeable. I'm far from that at all. But we don't want the process, the frame to impose that. We don't want that to come from the rules. We want that to come from the people doing the work. Less people segregation means more people integration. So what does that imply? It implies fewer departments, probably, or I mean, not having the need for separate departments. A truly agile organization wouldn't have a business side and an IT side, because every team is there to solve a business problem. This would also suggest if we're less functional specialization, means more functions are covered. So a department for a function, hopefully everyone will see that there's a contradiction there. Less organizational complexity. Maybe this is counterintuitive, but it leads to more organization. And if you watch for a while, I think you, with your eyes open, I think you would start to see this. Fewer branches means more technical integration. There's a debate right now about what to call the trunk in Git. Let's call it the code. Let's just call it the trunk. Calling it a main branch makes me nervous because it implies that there's other branches, and branching is harmful towards integration. The integration cost increases exponentially, the cost of merge failures. And it's not just the merge conflicts we can detect that concern me, it's the ones that we don't detect right off the bat. So we want this. We want fewer branches. We have more integration with fewer branches. A less burdensome process means more learning. Less burdensome process means more fun. Less functional specialization means more functions are covered. We start to blur the lines now. Less component specialization means that the components work together. So we get better components with less component specialization. You can tell by looking at the code when it's been just one team or one group of people working on it. Less management pressure on teams means more management happens. More things are managed. So this is sometimes a struggle when people are learning Scrum and ask them, so who manages the team? And they say, well, no one. So no, I don't think that's not the same. A self-managing team isn't no one managing the team. And I remember that working for a direct manager and working for a boss could sit on my desk all day and still not really understand what I'm doing. But my team does, and my team can tell when I'm having a good day, when I need help, when things are not going well for me. They can tell that. So it's not like there's no, it's not talking about no management. We're talking about self-management team, because we think actually more management can happen that way. More effective management can happen that way. Less management pressure on teams, though, means more effective management. What gets managed is more effective. So with pressure implies also less emphasis on estimates, with some people suggesting the ideal amount of emphasis might be 0. Not going to estimate that. But less emphasis on that means that the team owns the things that they sign up to do. They own their responsibilities. They own their, we don't use the word commitment anymore, but they own their goal, right? That's something they decided to do. It's not down to the numbers. It's not based on, they can't blame the estimates for anything. It's team's decision to decide, what are we going to take on this sprint? What are we going to try to do this sprint? I want them to own that. And suggest also less hype implies that there's more meaningful change. There's a bubble that happens that kind of, I wouldn't have expected this back when I got into the Scrum world, how this bubble has emerged. I was asked to co-train with someone doing, her only experience was doing Scrum for real estate. I'm not seeing how I can, a person that's only done Scrum for that, I'm wondering how, I'm thinking about Victor's talk, how could I recommend that person to coach product development organization? Now, I'm sure that there's something useful that they could offer, but I think that developers want to hear from someone who's had some time doing the stuff that they do, knows a bit about that, what that problem domain is. So less theater, I'll call it change theater, I think in the long run means more meaningful change, more real change will actually happen. And what's another one? Less accommodation of poor technical practices means more responsiveness to customer needs. So instead of mapping dependencies using yarn and stuff and saying, okay, 3 sprints later, this team can do the thing that depends on that, we really want to reduce those constraints, ultimately break those constraints, rather than do them asynchronously. Find ways that teams can collaborate on shared work in a synchronous way. So we don't want to accommodate poor technical practices. We want to expose them and change them, right? This doesn't happen overnight. Less extrinsic manipulators means more intrinsic motivation. And there's a fair amount of research suggesting that extrinsic manipulators are actually poisoning the intrinsic motivation. So it's not just that, if you think, it's not in addition to the intrinsic motivation, it actually dilutes the intrinsic motivation. We believe that self-powered teams, self-motivated teams will always do better than teams that are being manipulated. Of course, how do you measure that? And I think that the emphasis on quantification makes it harder to see what's really happening. The stuff that really matters the most, it's very difficult to quantify. Less stuff between the developers and the customers. For example, engagement managers or other kinds of roles between the developers and the customers means more customer engagement. The idea is we're trying to bring the Gemba of value creation as close as we can to the Gemba of value consumption. Most of my motivation as a programmer came from seeing the product actually working and people using the product. Now, I'm granted there's motivation from the code also, seeing how beautiful it is and making it work and all that, working with my colleagues. But really the stuff I'm most proud of is the stuff that's produced value for people, and I can see that. And by working directly with customers, I develop empathy for them and a better understanding, an intuitive understanding of what their real needs are. And result is more satisfaction in my work from doing that. So don't manipulate me. Yeah, don't put an engagement man. Don't put someone between me and the people that my code is for. Taking the joy out of my job by doing that. So yeah, this is why I really like more with less. I think we should stick with this as our slogan. Less artifacts means better artifacts. In Scrum, there are only 3 artifacts, right? There's the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product itself, the increment. and we want those things to be as good as they can be. A separate specification that's out of sync with the actual behavior. I would rather have a living specification, for example, specification by example. I'd much rather have that, and that's part of the product, part of the increment. So less cancerous growth of Scrum means more meaningful growth of Scrum, the way I see it. I'm not a huge fan of Scrum for everything in the kitchen sink. Welcome to Tchotchkes. I'll be your Scrum Master. The chief product owner will seat you. I don't think Scrum is for running restaurants or real estate or maybe even for Scrum consultancies. I think Scrum, at least the kind of Scrum I'm interested in, is for product development. That's where I'd like to focus anyway. Hardware, software, new product development, maybe some. I don't want to shut down the experiments because that sounds kind of negative also, but I also want to be very careful about the potential for hype here. We want less BS and more with less. We have 50 people here, and I'm curious what questions they've managed to stir or who have managed to offend by now.
We have one comment from James who said, rather than ask like a single source of truth, I guess he's asking if that's the only source of truth, like you were preaching the less rules. Like, how would you respond to that one?
Oh, I don't know. I think the less rules came about through a lot of experience working with people working with customers.
No, I misread that. James means the other name for the master Tarank branch, the single source of truth, like the code.
Yeah.
There's this. I got it.
Yeah. They're saying a man who owns 2 watches doesn't know what time it is. What's the saying? That was a Russian saying, actually, wasn't it?
We don't have it, I guess, this way because yes, we don't have too many watches. Yeah, so
I have a Russian watch right here.
Guys, please type the questions in the chat, or otherwise me and Evgeny will be asking the questions, and you don't want to have that. So trying to manipulate you extrinsically. But while you're typing, Michael, I have this question, right? So you said Scrum is not for non-product development activities, right? Or this Scrum you are mastering is not for product development activities, right?
Yeah, and when you put it that way, maybe it's not what I mean exactly.
Okay, would you clarify that? Because like my question is like you have non-product development activities within organizations who actually produce products, right? So, and LeSS is Scrum applied to the entire organization, or is it not? Like, how would you integrate the other non-delivery departments into the
I guess, yeah. So let's. I'd want to find out more specifically what they are. In many companies, a long time ago, I read a book called Group Genius by Keith Sawyer, and he looked at the effectiveness of R&D in companies, and it seemed like the companies that were spending the most on R&D were often getting the least value from it. They had an R&D department again, just doing research, just doing all this hypothetical, theoretical stuff, versus companies that were doing it more effectively. And ironically, they're spending less money on R&D as a separate thing, but they had people from regular business rotating in and out of this and incorporating it into the work that they were doing. So to me, that's an example of something that should be incorporated into, especially with product development. Product development is R&D. So why isn't that part of what the feature teams are doing, for instance? That'd be one example.
Right.
Yeah, I guess another example, a lot of companies have, well, what to do with support is another interesting problem, or operational work. And it's pretty typical. Nearly every company has, like, some of a certain size has a group that's doing keeping the stuff running, keeping the lights on, keeping the servers running, dealing with customer issues when stuff falls over, rebooting servers. And maybe that should also be a product developer responsibility, or that should be part of the teams, because I want to know why the product is falling over so often. And maybe the people creating a product, involved with developing the product, should be more connected to that. I heard someone say, you never see someone washing a rental car. You know, you take care of your own stuff, but if it's someone else's stuff, or it's going to be handed off to someone, you're not thinking about it as much. Right. So I guess, yeah, I'd want to be specific about what that responsibility is that we're putting into another group. And then there's some of the stuff that we think HR is supposed to do, like develop their employees, their career paths and all that. Now, why can't that be on the team? I mean, the people who know me the best, I mean, why wouldn't I? This is what we did. I was in a small company, and that's what we did for each other. You know, how would help? Why can't we help each other develop as individuals, the people that I work with directly, instead of having it be a dedicated specialty in the company, a department that does that?
Okay. We got a Wikipedia like a clarification for the watch thing you've mentioned from Eve. So it's called Segal's law. A man with a watch knows what time it is. A man with two watches is never sure. Originates from San Diego 100 years ago.
Oh, ancient San Diego history.
All right. And we have a question. So in your video on Scrum scaling, you ask people what scares them about role-free self-management teams. Did you get some responses from that? If you
one person, Darren Quinoa, wrote to me, and the concern was someone that used to have management power over the team, being on the team that they used to have management power over. Is that going to color their interactions? Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. I can see how that history could affect the way they interact with each other. For me, it's kind of interesting hanging out with people that used to be my boss, and there's still kind of a feeling there's still not exactly peers, even though we should be. So at least for me, it does have kind of an impact. So I guess it leaves an imprint. Can we convert it? We can build an agile organization from the ground up, because I've seen that done. Changing an existing organization to be agile, the track record for that is, I can't say it's great. And this is where I say less hype means more meaningful change. I think we have to be realistic that this is not something that happens overnight. I asked a question on LinkedIn. Actually, I posed the challenge on LinkedIn saying, I think this transformation that's being sold as agile transformation is bunk. Can you show me an example of a large-scale transformation? I think that adoptions happen, and fits and starts with setbacks, and they plateau for a long time. All the examples that I know of. If we're taking an existing traditional company, right, starting from that, and I believe it's not a zero-sum game. I believe we do meaningful work, but I think it seems misleading to sell it as a transformation that's just going to change everything like that.
Right.
And especially if if all the people, if there's no turnover at all, can it really change? I mean, theater, it should be possible. But the examples that I know of where there was a meaningful change, there was some turnover. Some people left.
Yeah,
as part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard some people comparing the old traditional organizations with like dinosaurs, right? Which, well, you can try transforming into something more evolutionary, functional, but maybe you'd rather not do that and just help the younger ones, like mammals, right, to survive and
Yeah.
rule the new world. Like,
Yeah. Unfortunately, the mammals can't pay for consultancies and training and stuff. It seems like a lot of the coaches or trainers, people I work with, financial industry, fintech sometimes, just because that's where the money is. And then, even though I don't know if it's anyone's favorite thing to do, because those places, making a meaningful change in those places, it seems to be especially hard.
yeah. And another example of why change is hard. I've heard Craig Alarman on his training mentioning the CEO cycle. Like every time the CEO changes in the company, you basically like the changes getting rolled back to where they were below, and then basically less adoption starts over. And if the new CEO is not a favor, so like MJ, like, are we hopeful? The world, because I guess the 54 people who are watching us, they want to do
Do we
good.
want to discourage them?
And they
Well,
want
let's remember, sense of humor was actually in the rules for less huge. Yeah, so if you're in a company that's beyond 8 teams, I guess a lot of people probably in this session are in such places. Yeah, so I'm gonna break my promise of not reading any other less huge rules. One of the less huge rules: remember, each day, less huge adoptions, meaning more than 8 teams, take months or years, infinite patience, and a sense of humor.
Right.
So there you go. And as far as should we be optimistic or pessimistic, a place that I worked with a long time ago, which at the time was the most successful adoption of Agile methods that I had seen up until that time. And the same thing happened. They were successful, and so they were purchased by a bigger company with predictable. And of course, at first, the bigger company says, "No, we want to be more like you, and we're going to copy your ideas in our bigger company." But of course, that's not what happened. And eventually, the smart people left the company that was bought. But in several cases, I've seen those people later on, and they went to be involved with other companies that were starting, and the stuff that they learned was part of what they built into the new place that they were developing. Thinking of managers again as a kind of developer, people who develop organizations. So in that sense, I'm optimistic, and the rate of companies staying in business versus failing is changing quite radically. Companies going out of business faster than ever before. So one way or another, I believe you'll have to work in an Agile organization because the ones that aren't Agile won't be able to compete. There's going to be some inertia, I think. There's some momentum. Big companies have patents and things like that, and they have legal departments that can. And there's certain economies of scale that they have. Big companies, Sony, Google, etc. But I also think it'll be very difficult to compete with the mammals.
All right, makes sense. To wrap up, I'd like to show your 30 seconds video, if I'm allowed.
Yes.
It has only 400 views, so maybe we can contribute to its success, right, altogether. I'm not sure it has any sound, though, but...
It doesn't.
All right, MJ, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.